Well, it's a huge pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce Nicholas this evening as our lecturer. He's going to talk about his excavations at Abu Salabikh, which he conducted between 1975 and 1990. And as many of you will know, when he started the excavations, Nicholas had been recently appointed as the director of the British School of Archaeology in Baghdad. And as far as the school was concerned, it was rather a new departure because initially, after the school had been founded, Max Mallowan conducted excavations in Syria at Tel Brak and Chagha Bazar. When it was possible and the circumstances were right to come back to Iraq, he started a great project at Nimrud, and the school worked there between 1949 and 1963. And subsequently, David Oates continued excavations in the north of Iraq, but not at Nimrud, at Tel al-Ramah. So it was something of a departure for Nicholas to choose a site in the south of Iraq, and I think it's true to say that you did so, obviously, because you were interested in the Sumerians, and some previous excavations at Abu Salabikh had shown it to be a very important site, and some remarkable tablets had been found there, read by Professor Bob Biggs. But I have to say, as I said, some people had hoped that the school would continue to work in the north and build on the legacy that they had there. So it was a bit of a departure, Nicholas moving to the south, but it was a decision that was entirely and completely vindicated, as we're going to hear, because he had 15 years of very successful work there and made a number of very, very remarkable discoveries, I think, which have enlarged our knowledge hugely about the Sumerian civilization of southern Iraq. And I think the school is very privileged, actually, to have been associated with those excavations. So without further ado, can I ask you all to join me in welcoming Nicholas to give his lecture?
Thank you very much, John. Now, is the microphone working? Audible? Yeah, good. I think it's fair to say that Nimrud had quite a backlog of publication to go, so maybe it was time to move on to somewhere else. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, this is quite like old times. The last time I talked about Abu Salabikh to the BSAI, as it was then, was on February the 11th, 1976, so just over 44 years ago. Of course, it was not here, but in Burlington House, and rather scarily, I found myself facing in the front row, not 4 members of my offspring, as tonight, but Donald Wiseman and David Oates, the chairman and vice chairman of the school, and also Max Mallowan, Seton Lloyd, and indeed Mortimer Wheeler. 15 years went by, as John has just said, until work came abruptly to a standstill in 1990. And twice that time has passed since then, till the present day, so I feel it's high time to take stock and ponder what next. And I'm doubly grateful to BISI for inviting me to talk. Gives me an opportunity to pay tribute, if only indirectly, to some of the colleagues with whom the whole project could not have happened. I will just single out Bob Biggs because he's rather special, and this person is also present in the audience at the moment. So when in 1972 I found myself in Iraq with the opportunity to start a new project, I wanted an early but also a literate site with the extra dimension that written documents would give. Something halfway in time and in scale between Diana Kirkbride's Neolithic oligo processing plant near Hatra, and Max Mallowan's imperial project at Nimrud. I decided to play safe and go for a site where the documentation was already present, by choosing Abu Salabikh, where Vaughn, Crawford and Donald Hansen had unintentionally stumbled on what I think to this day can still be called the world's earliest library. Now, I'm going to try and make these things move on. That's not it. That one? Yeah, okay. That's where it is in Iraq. And the tablets, which... This is one of the tablets which Bob Biggs published, and here's one of him. Oh, what's it done? It's behaving rather strangely. That one? Okay. Right, thank you. Okay. Don Hansen and Vaughn Crawford had, in the meantime, transferred their attentions to the contemporary but much larger city of Lagash at Al-Hibba, and generously raised no objections to the British school starting to work at Abu Salabikh. In February 1973, after tutorials from David Oates on the roof of the schoolhouse in Baghdad, that's the roof, and that's the view we had from there, on the use of a theodolite, and indoors on the trigonometry and 7-figure log tables, which were required in those days. I spent 3 weeks at the site. What's it doing? Ah, oh, right. No. Go back. Back. Yes, okay. I spent 3 weeks at the site, and there it is, in perfect weather, planning the site with a Shagati pole bearer and a stinking cold. And I can't resist showing once more the photo of the visitors we received. There is the plan of the site, and that's a satellite photograph, courtesy Elizabeth Stone. You can see, if you compare the two, the green stuff is the archaeological site. The visitation we received for some of the people who are there, Miguel Civil, of course, perhaps the most important, but Diana Kirkbride is there, and very important on the left is Halaf, the brother of Dola, my Shagati pole bearer. Thanks to David's tuition, 3 weeks was just about enough to complete the plan of the site, and so we were ready to start excavation in 1975. We did the obvious thing, which was to revisit the building where the library was found, and there is the room 39, as it's called. I'm in trouble with the technology. Come back, there we are. With grave 1 marked there. I think in 1965, when the library was discovered, if asked where would you expect to find a library in ancient Sumer, most colleagues would have replied, in a temple. And the puzzle was that the building, which Don Hansen and Vaughn Crawford had excavated, didn't look like a temple, and a solution was still needed. Our success there was partial. There were a few more tablets, 2 of which will feature later, but although we extended the plan of the building, its exact nature remained and still remains uncertain. There was one significant addition to the building plan, and that was the grave here in room 39, reception room. Under the floor, which had been carefully relaid, the room had played host to 4 similar graves, one of which was completely undisturbed. That's unfortunately a rather rare event. But there is the plan of the burial, and there is the corpse with a mortar and stone bowl and other pottery showing. By comparison with some other burials found in later seasons, it was not specially rich in jewellery or other precious items, but there was an awful lot of pottery, as you can see there. One thing, though, was clear, that this was not the inner sanctum, the cellar, or the, as you might say, the throne room of the deity. It's notoriously difficult. There's the plan of the... I was talking about this room here, which is not the cellar of the temple. It's notoriously difficult to establish the purpose of the different rooms and what went on in them. The trouble with continuously occupied settlements is they don't get burnt down often enough. The catastrophe which overtook Hassanlu, or the pre-Sargonic palace at Ebla, is a field day for archaeologists, but when thrifty burghers in a Sumerian city choose to renovate their accommodation, they don't leave much lying around on the floor for us to retrieve. There was, though, one type of artifact which they did leave on the floor, rather surprisingly, perhaps, cuneiform tablets. There they are, not very impressive. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. After all, our bins are sometimes known as waste paper baskets. Once a document is no longer needed, you may as well leave it lying around or recycle it. Chicago had found more than 300 tablets. The majority weren't administrative texts, but literary and lexical compositions. Still pretty much the world's first library, but they had all been left lying around in a large pit. What we found in the corner of room 48 were almost the only ones still in their original setting. Some were yet more literary texts, but others were administrative documents. Those are my favourites. Sumerian literature is marvellous, but for archaeologists it's not the poets, but the accountants who are most useful. Two of these tablets in particular seem to resolve the question of who had been writing them. This one, it lists 13,972 sheep and goats, rather more than any single household could manage, so presumably belonging to what we would think of as a public institution, which in ancient Mesopotamia is going to mean either a palace or a temple. The other, this one, is a list of plots of land assigned to different people. The total area is summarized as 38 bur. That, in metric, is nearly 250 hectares, which would make a strip 800 meters wide each side of the river, all the way downstream to Nippur. Most of the landholders are listed by name and are assigned 1 or 2 bur each. A bur is about 6 hectares. But the list begins with the largest plot of 3 bur, which is assigned to the mistress, or the queen, followed by 2 bur to the god, Shara, and 2 bur to the provincial governor, the NC. The queen must have been a goddess, with Shara her consort, as it were, her Duke of Edinburgh. In 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, there are 2 kinds of goddesses, spouses of important gods and important goddesses with spouses. Ours must be the second kind, and there aren't many of them. There's Inanna, there's Ninhursag under various names, and Nisaba. Nisaba is the goddess of reeds, and because reeds provide the stylus of scribal craft. It would take me too long to argue the case, and I have to admit it's still not proven, but in my mind, I'm fairly sure the best candidate here is Nisaba, and she was the patron deity of the city of Eresh, one of the premier league of Sumerian cities in the mid-3rd millennium. It features in the Sumerian literary canon. The myth we know as Enlil and Sud describes how on a visit to Eresh, Enlil, the chief god of Sumer, who was at the time an eligible bachelor living in Nippur, was smitten by the sight of a young girl, rather endearingly described as being like a tall, beautifully shaped cow. His initial advances made her scuttle back indoors, but eventually, after a protracted exchange of messages and gifts in the Middle Eastern way, he gets his girl and she becomes his wife and is given the name Ninlil. My point here is that the geographical setting of myths of this kind tends to reflect political realities on the purely human plane, and so this story suggests that Nippur and Eresh enjoyed close relations at some time in the 3rd millennium. And this is easy to understand if Eresh is in fact Abu Salabikh, only 16 kilometers upstream along the river. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much whether I'm right or not about Eresh, satisfying though it would be. Our new tablets hinted that there must be a temple in the vicinity, and what the text suggested, the archaeology confirmed. Outside the building to the southeast, there must originally have been a precipitous drop, but by the time we arrived, it was filled up with layer upon layer of rubbish. And on the left is the side of the building, and the sloping lines there are the rubbish 6 meters deep. We called it the ash tip. And like similar rubbish tips excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley outside the temple at Ur, these layers were full of clay ceilings from jars, like that, seal impressions on the clay, little animal figurines, people figurines, miniature pots, they're very small, 5 centimeter scale, and discs made from potsherds, which I've whizzed past, which were probably used as counters. All this was published in exemplary detail by Tony Green, much missed, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that we are looking at a giant refuse tip packed with things discarded from a temple. So we were fairly sure now that the library was attached to, or very closely placed, alongside a temple. We still hadn't located the inner sanctum, but for the time being there were wider issues on our mind. Just as we needed a more meaningful context for the library and the other cuneiform tablets, we also needed a context for the building which housed them within the city as a whole. At this point, I want to leave that question hanging in the air and change the subject slightly. These 4 mounds at Abu Salabikh, this is the Uruk mound, which is 4th millennium. This is with West mound. I'm just going to talk about briefly. The main part of the site is here, the main mound. The one to the south is probably a later suburb, a new city. It was obvious from the surface pottery of the West mound that it was earlier than the main mound where we'd started work. And since the first centuries of the 3rd millennium, early Dynastic 1 are little known because they're usually buried under early Dynastic 2 and early Dynastic 3, it seemed worth investigating. So to find out what was going on, we adopted a strategy of clearing just the surface to see what might lie beneath. And there we are at it. You can see a very large oven circular in the center. This worked quite well. We thought it would help to have vertical shots of each square, and since this was the day, in the days before ubiquitous drones, we created a bipod from which we suspended a camera. Moving it around was somewhat laborious, and memorably Roger Murray, who was conscripted into the process when he joined us in 1977, commented that he now knew what it was like being the back legs of a pantomime horse. It wasn't actually very helpful in all. The result of the scraping was to expose a layout of early dynastic walls, here, in particular, these big enclosure walls here. Overlying a tell of Uruk date with these thick enclosure walls evidently delimiting town quarters, what our US colleagues will call neighborhoods. It looks as though the city was here in about 2900 BC, but not long after the main settlement moved to the main mound where we were concentrating our efforts. We don't know why the inhabitants moved around, but the West Mound and the even earlier Uruk Mound are separated from the main mound and the South Mound by a barren depression called by the locals the Shat al-Hawa, the Wind River. We suspected this could have been a watercourse, And one reason why these earlier mounds are so clearly separate is that they were on the other side of the river or canal. Initially, this was just a guess. But in 1988 and 1989, Tony Wilkinson joined us. And here he is drilling down. Tony was the perfect collaborator. He knew exactly what he and we wanted to do. He knew exactly how to do it. He did it with the minimum of fuss, and then, rarest of all, he wrote up his results in double quick time. So here he is extracting his cores and examining them in detail. His results told us just what we wanted to know, which is basically that there was a large river channel here, 20 meters wide, which has to be at least one branch of the Euphrates, and it would, of course, been the quickest way to get to Nippur. I like to imagine the teenage Ninlil standing on the bank, being ogled by Enlil. Abu Salabikh's relationship to Nippur shows here on Adams's map. He hasn't really got a good Euphrates branch there, but it's clear there must have been one running between the two. Well, to revert to the main mound, we still needed to place the presumed temple in its wider context. And the obvious thing at first sight was to expand the area of excavation in Area E, which we started to do in 1978. It was that year we had a visit from Kyler Young of Toronto, with his year's experience digging in Iran. And one day, standing with him looking down at a square, which had nothing but 4 balks and a couple of mud brick walls in it, I experienced one of those light bulb moments. He inquired politely, what were we getting out of this trench? And it struck me at that moment that we could, of course, get the same essential information merely by scraping the surface, as we hadn't just been doing on the West Mound. Quite why that hadn't occurred to me before, I have no idea, but it came at a good moment because I was beginning to be acutely aware of the statistics of moving soil. And that's what I'm talking about there. If we wanted to clear the main mound, well, we're talking something in high 7 figures. Bluntly, time and money dictate what we can hope to achieve, and looking at these figures, it was clear there was no way we could excavate our way to recovering even a fraction of the early dynastic city. So while we did carry on exploring the temple area in the traditional way, a lot of time and effort now went into scraping, or more elegantly, surface clearance. And because it worked, we kept going throughout the 1980s. We worked 10 metres square by 10 metres square. It had to be done in the spring, because in the autumn there was no moisture in the ground and no colour in the soil. Here you can see, on the bottom left is the surface soil, and then scrape away, and suddenly the colours spring out at you. Even in the spring, a spray would be quite helpful, and here an agricultural spray is bringing out the colours as well. The workmen loved it, because we gave them a gubala, a contract, along the lines of, when you've finished your square, you can buzz off home. And it greatly accelerated the process, leading to the rare sight of barrow boys running, not otherwise seen. They didn't do all the hard work. Here's a couple of hard workers, one of whom's in the room today, scraping one of our squares on the main mound. And the results would have looked like this. This is one of the notebooks with the plan recovered from the scraping. And to cut a long story short, we were still scraping in 1989, and the cumulative result shows here in this plan of the city. City walls, streets, lanes, orange things are where there has to be a gate, and the green bits are rubbish. What does it reveal? It didn't sometimes take very much to expose the city wall. This didn't require much effort, but down here at the bottom is the inside of the city, the fawn-coloured stuff going away into the distance is the wall, probably not brick, but mud in this case, and then at the far end, the outside of the city. The walls, being mud brick, had been eroded completely flat. I'm going back to them now. You can also see the network of the main streets, the narrow lanes, and we also recovered numerous house plans, and 2 of these were so well preserved that we thought they would repay excavation. So here is a more recent satellite photograph from 2003, again thanks to Elizabeth Stone, and I'm going to be talking about one house here we call 5G, and another house here we call 6H. And the white stuff is not snow, but the salt that comes out of the soil after rain. There's quite a lot of it, as you can see. The 5G house is here, there. That's what we found after clearing. And then after excavating, we have the plan of the house looking like that. The walls were virtually intact, except for a large lake pit on the southwest corner. So effectively we started knowing the plan instead of having to wait until we had excavated it. The central courtyard, it's got a will of its own, this thing. That'll do. The central courtyard here and the main reception room were fairly obvious. But what was the function of all the other rooms? We didn't expect to find much lying around on the floors, for reasons I've already mentioned. But the Sumerian housewives couldn't sweep away some of their microscopic debris. So this is where we called on Wendy Matthews and her expertise in micromorphology. And I hope I can go back to find that Wendy in action. And what she's getting out of the sides by means of this sort of sample is a detailed microscopic view of the stratification. And this isn't actually from that house, but it's an example of a courtyard area with the succession of accumulations, the sample she's taking bottom left, and then under high magnification, this is the sort of thing you see. In the plan of the house, the small soundings in each room in yellow gave us a cross-section of the stratigraphy and allowed her to take micromorphological samples through the room fill and especially the floors. And so we are now fairly sure which rooms acted as storerooms or as kitchen and dining rooms and washing and splashing areas. On the macro scale, the most interesting of the rooms was up here, under here where you can't actually see through, attached to the reception room. There was an unusual fireplace there let into the wall, and from the ashy fill in it we retrieved 6 little beasts there. To hedge one's bets, archaeologists will call them quadrupeds without committing themselves as to what their species is, but I guess they're most, if all not, sheep. Figurines like this are surprisingly rare in other excavated contexts at the site, with the single exception of Tony Green's ash tip, and it seems pretty clear that this is a rudimentary forerunner of the house shrines, which are so familiar to us from Woolley's Old Babylonian housing quarter at Ur, some half a millennium later. The other house, in square 6H on the main street leading north from the temple area, looks like that. It was quite a different kettle of fish. For one thing, it was quite a bit bigger, about 500 square meters, That's one of the biggest early dynastic houses excavated anywhere. But the most obvious difference is that it was riddled with graves. The blue thing in the middle is not a swimming pool, but a grave. And there it is. I can assure you it was big. I can assure you the diminutive figure in the bottom left-hand corner there is, in fact, a full-size archaeologist. And if any of you know Prof, you will confirm that. It measured 5.5 meters by 3 meters 40 and was 2 meters 40 deep. One reason for the size of the grave must have been to make room for a pair of equids. Now, equid is another hedge betting term. Here I mean probably a donkey and onager hybrid, which we know they bred before the arrival of the horse. The backbone of one of them had remained in place on the left-hand side, and it's there. And in another grave in the temple area, we actually had 2 complete equid skeletons side by side in one of the graves. So that explains the size of the grave which they dug. And most of you will be very familiar with this picture, but just to remind you that they were using equids to tow chariots. We don't know if there was a chariot in that tomb. There was room for it, but virtually everything had been robbed out. And those, I couldn't resist putting them in, thanks to Juliet Clutton-Brock, another of our collaborators, no longer with us, these rather endearing hybrids from the Schönbrunn Zoo. Apart from the backbone of one equid, virtually the only other component of that burial was a little clutch of jewellery, which the robbers must have missed, and when reconstructed, it looked like that. Lots of lapis lazuli, and carnelian, rock crystal, and cosmetic shells. This tomb must have been for the head of the household. If we think about it, excavating the tomb and removing and then replacing 45 cubic meters of soil must have been a logistical nightmare, and probably as part of the operation, the other rooms in the house had their floors relaid. When the next family member needed a grave, there was clearly no room in the courtyard, and most of the surrounding rooms had one or more graves sunk beneath the floor. And this is the later phase with tombs marked. Most of these had been thoroughly robbed, but not all, and I'm just going to show you one particularly poignant example. This is grave 246, and that jumble of bone is a couple of children. The plan looks like that, the bottom of the grave, and then the upper part that we came on. The strips across would have been something to do with the roofing arrangement for the grave. And the particularly poignant thing about the tomb was they had little stone cosmetic containers, small pots and so on, and the pots in particular were miniature versions of what adults had in their tombs. So there they were. They were probably between sort of 4 and 12, the children. And, of course, they were elite. Here's some of the jewellery that they had with them. Well, thanks to the family's concern to keep their senior members on the premises, not a great deal of the floor surfaces of the living rooms survived, but the living members did leave some remnants of their presence in the house. And this collection of pottery was the main component. It comes from this space here, just under what we're fairly sure was the stair. This was underneath the stairs, which would have gone up to the roof. And I'm just going to be talking about this circular item here. The pottery was here. That's Helen MacDonald with our workman Adai beavering away, and what we came upon, the circular item, was a drain made up of these ceramic cylinders. This isn't actually the one we found, but this is to show you what they looked like. And I call them drains, but it's quite clear they were sewers. They were in the loo. Mm-hmm.
What's the scale?
The scale is going to be a 1 meter scale. I think that's a 1 meter scale. Yeah. And here is Adai. Well, you can see now, he's in it. He's trying to excavate it, but he found it rather difficult, as you can imagine, going further down. And we later got a smaller member of the work team to continue down. One of the zembils of earth that he pulled up contained a lump of mud, which on cleaning turned out to be this little round clay tablet, which once cleaned and read is a Sumerian incantation for the relief of intestinal disorders. And one does have to wonder if it's a coincidence that we found it down the loo. The lavatory led off a kitchen utility room with small bread ovens, and this in turn was reached from the main kitchen, where there was a much bigger oven. Although the occupants cleared out their rooms when they rebuilt, leaving none of their kitchen utensils for us to find, whether they were pots or grindstones, there were some traces of their presence they couldn't conceal. Floors in the kitchen area were regularly very black with ash and burned food remains, and it's certainly not a coincidence that Wendy's micromorphological sections revealed minute fragments of volcanic grindstones, the black stuff that you see in that microscopic cross-section. In among the debris on the floors or in the builder's backfill were the remnants of their meals, bones and seeds. We spent a lot of time flotating samples to retrieve carbonized plant remains. They seem to take rather a long time to analyse, but I am hoping a report will be forthcoming from Oxford in time to be included in the publication of the House later this year. As for the bones, a preliminary look at them by Sebastian Payne has given us a rough idea of the non-vegetarian diet, one of the most interesting points being that shed milk teeth show that there were little piglets roaming the streets, though not inside the house. Pigs are very rarely mentioned in the texts, probably because they were beneath the accountant's notice, but we do know that their fat, or lard, was a staple commodity, and my guess is that they needed it not so much for the kitchen, but for the bathroom and the laundry as the principal ingredient of soap. Well, at the end of the 1989 season, we'd more or less completed our investigation of these two big early dynastic houses, and we've learnt a lot about urban living at the top end of the social spectrum. We could write a Sumerian estate agent's specification for a desirable residence. From the surface plans, we can see that there were many other multi-roomed residences, especially in the southern half of the main mound, but that obviously can't be the whole picture. I'll go back to the city plan. One of the questions at the back of one's mind about any site is the size of the population. The total area occupied by each settlement, which has sometimes been used in default of better measures, is obviously a very blunt instrument. And here at Abu Salabikh, we can at least identify how much of the main mound was given over to human habitation. In more detail, taking one 50 by 50 metre block, we can map it out and see what proportion of the main mound was devoted to various purposes. And here, what you can do is, if you start on the top left, the visible mound, the red bit is the space occupied by the city wall. We can discount that for living. And then the urban space, you can cut out the public space, that's streets and lanes and so on. And also the rubbish dumps. And then you're left with houses. And with the houses, of course, you have to discount the walls, the space occupied by the walls. And you end up also the courtyard, and you end up finally with the bottom right-hand corner read the roofed space, and you should calculate the population in relation to that space. When I wrote an article called How Many Sumerians Per Hectare, the answer appeared to be between 248 and 1,205. That doesn't seem to be very helpful, but it's better than nothing. And given that the main mound occupies about 11 hectares, its total population would have fallen between 2,728 and 13,255. That's slightly less than the sheep and goats. The true number, no doubt, falls somewhere between the two extremes, but one has to admit it would be nice to be a bit more precise, and there may be a long way to go before we are more accurate. For one thing, these calculations rather assumed that the density of occupation was fairly consistent across the mound, but that's certainly misleading. We can't assume that the city was a consistent spread of elite urban residences. Where did the other half live? And we know that there was at least one huge rubbish dump inside the walls. And there's also reason to reconstruct an industrial zone. At Abu Salabikh, the clinker, Arabic salbuch, therefore the site is actually named after it, Salabikh being the plural, the clinker is very obvious because it's so overfired that unlike ordinary potsherds, it can't be turned into sand by the effects of salt and rain. And it's not very obvious, but the pile on the right is sherds from excavation, the pile on the left is sherds from the surface of the mound, and I think you can see that they are sort of olive green, the ones that are on the surface, because all the others had simply been disintegrated by the effects of salt on the surface. And we know what happened. This is the corner of a kiln in one of the earlier houses, and you can see the olive green effect of the high temperature on the clay lining the kiln. That was in an ordinary residential house of ED2 date. Later on, pottery production seems to have been centralized and standardized, as shown by serial miners. And in one particular area, right up at the north end of the city, this is our camp, and I'm talking about just beyond, past the roof on the left-hand side of the picture. The surface of the mound was black, and it looked suspiciously as if there was a lot of industrial activity going on. We put a small sounding down, and in the courtyard we found layers of dirty accumulation, and here in particular you can see stuff which has come out of a high temperature kiln. On the floor, one of the floors, we found this disc here reconstituted, so the reason for the kilns became obvious. This we would call a potter's disc. One can't call it a potter's wheel because it didn't itself rotate. Instead, it must have been the emplacement for a revolving wooden contraption. And the layers of ashy debris were stuffed with overfired kiln wasters, along with fragments of still unfired pottery, which had never made it into the kiln, and also clay ceilings. Here's a couple of examples. These are animal conflict contest scenes. On the back of these, there was often the impression of a door closure, and this seems to underline that this was not an ordinary household baking its own pots, but a professional establishment. I suppose we would say that the potter lived above the shop. Here again, there was a rectangular cut in the floor of the courtyard, and I'm afraid our potter was at the bottom of it. There he is. He's only got a conical bowl and a spouted jar by his head. But he must be the potter in person. Since it was in 1989, he did at least avoid the obvious fate of being christened Harry. All he had with him were these pots, and on reflection, we must owe him a lot, because he must have been personally responsible for a great many of the thousands of potsherds laboriously processed over our 15 years in his city by our pottery experts. Here then, at the north end of the city, we were not in the elite quarter of the city, and it served to make the point that if we could see the entire city plan, we should expect to see a good deal of variety in the city quarters. As things stood at the end of the 1989 season, we had recovered the plan of 271 10-metre squares, and that amounts to just about 25%, a quarter of the entire main mound. And it looks like that, with some of the detail now added to the main plan. A good rule of thumb in archaeology, given how much it costs in time and money, is that when your results repeat themselves and become predictable, it's probably time to move on. Here at Abu Salabikh, the clear differences between the Potter's Quarter and the elite houses clustered around the temple suggest that we haven't actually reached this replication threshold, and there's much still to learn about the anatomy of the city. So, in 1989, one of the objectives for our next season would have been to expose some more of the Potter's house, more of the room we suspect is the temple's inner sanctum, and of course some more scraping, perhaps especially on the south mound, where we suspect there was a palace, or hedging our bets again, a large administrative building. However, man proposes, and in this case, Saddam Hussein disposes. That's Kuwait, in 1990. Just as Keith Dobney was about to fly out and study several seasons of our animal bone, the Iraqi tanks rumbled into Kuwait and all bets were off. Throughout the 1990s, the international sanctions regime made it financially impossible for foreign expeditions to work. We had been excavating at the site off and on since 1975, and it looked as though 1989 was time to conclude that the project had run its course. I can't list all the diggers, more than in 3 figures, cataloguers, sherd processors and planners, other members from abroad and from Iraq who had worked with us. But in this context, I'd just like to single out the photographers, because that's their pictures you've been seeing this evening. And along with our generous sponsors and the management, it also seems right to acknowledge the overlong list of those no longer with us, some of whom I have mentioned already. So, with this obituary of the project, it might almost seem the moment to wind up my talk. But perhaps there's still just enough time to include a posthumous addendum. In 2002, with the generous cooperation of the State Board under Moed Damaji and Donnie George, I was able to pay a fleeting half-hour visit to the site and found the house still standing, or most of it still standing. I found 3 of the 4 separate rooms in reasonable shape, carefully bricked up by our faithful guard, though not before our fridge, our cooker, and all the shelving had been removed during the Shiite revolt of 1991. But more importantly, thanks to the village and the guard, the site itself was untouched, unlike so many in South Iraq. Peering through the window, one could see there were still sacks and sacks of archaeological material in there. That was 2002. I thought I'd better go before the Americans arrived. It wasn't until 2016, when taking time out from the celebration at the Basra Museum, I paid another flying visit to the site, and I realized that the buildings were collapsing, the roofs had caved in, and were home to termites, and the contents seriously in need of rescuing. The contents were not anything antiquities robbers would have been interested in. Anything nice, in our thinking, or museum-worthy, had already been sent to the Iraq Museum at the end of each season, and the sad irony is that all our cylinder seals are probably languishing in the safes of some shady antique dealers in the rest of the world, having been plundered along with so much else priceless from the museum in Iraq, in Baghdad, when in 2003 Mr. Rumsfeld's advance guard chose to allow the museum to be sacked. Still, what remained in the house, being sacks of potsherds and bones, still had a value for us, and so in 2017, with a lot of assistance from Professor Abbas al-Husseini and his colleagues in Diwaniyah, we launched a rescue bid and were able to salvage all the still labelled archaeological materials. Stick them in one of the ubiquitous Korean pickups and transfer them to storage in the inspectorate, the Mufettishiyah, in Diwaniyah, which is our local town. And there they are, inside the room, with the roof over them again. Better still, in May last year, Tina Greenfield and her two colleagues, Jane Gastra and Luther de Sousa, again, with fantastic cooperation from our Diwaniyah colleagues, finally took over the zooarchaeological baton, which was wrested from Keith Dobney's grasp in 1990, and succeeded in processing 130 animal bone assemblages. And there they are, triumphant at the end of their visit. The overall view of the more than 2,000 specimens they rescued from the 6H house alone, and the results looks like this. I'm not competent to comment on this in detail, but if you ask me if they had foxes, pigs, or tortoises, I can now tell you that they had. But more importantly, we will be able to say much more than before about how they butchered their omnipresent sheep and goats, and with isotope analyses, once our samples have been spirited out of the clutches of Iraqi customs, where they are still languishing 9 months on, and have found their way to Tina Greenfield's lab in Saskatchewan, we should be able to say something about where and what they pastured their 13,972 sheep and goats on. So the project lives on. By hook or by crook, Tina's report will be included in Volume 5 of Abu Salabikh excavations on the 2 early dynastic houses, which I'm intending to hand over to the printers this year. But I don't think we can stop there. Looking at the plan of our city, it must strike one that there are some rather large blank spaces. And that won't do. The cities of early dynastic Mesopotamia are the direct genetic ancestors of our urban world. Some of them, like Uruk itself, or Lagash at El Hibba, are astonishingly big. Here we have a small one, but with its library and its temple, it's still a classic example of a Sumerian city. And when it comes to the realities of archaeological work, small may not exactly be beautiful, but it is manageable. The plan of what we've done already does show what 1/4 of the city was like, but it's also a blueprint for the other 3/4, and there seems no reason why we should not fill in all the blanks. We couldn't possibly excavate it all, but scrape it? Why not? So, and here I think one must use inshallah, next January, epidemics permitting and everything else, we are hoping to make a start with Mary Shepperson, who's agreed to act as the field director, and with colleagues from the University of Qadisiyah, which is in Diwaniyah, and I believe that sort of cooperation is essential in this millennium. We make a start on the remaining 870 squares and properly resurrect our 3rd millennium Iraqi city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Does anyone have any questions for Professor Postgate?
Did we establish the exact purpose of that particular building that you were working in?
The possible temple?
Yes. Is it a temple?
The bit that tablets came from is clearly not a temple in the normal sense.
Yeah, but this is what you said.
It's recorded, so it
Yes.
has an
Okay. All right. Sorry. But it's closely aligned with rooms further south, one of which we are pretty sure is the inner sanctum of the temple building. I mean, the texts tell us, and also the rubbish tip tell us, that was a temple. It's clear that it must have been a temple. We haven't found the inner sanctum, except that we think we probably have. But of course, one of the rules of archaeology is the most important place to dig is under the dump. And it was underneath the Chicago dump. So we have excavated a room which is the largest reception room in the site, and has a sequence of, Wendy may remember, 17 very, very clean successive refloorings, which is typical of shrines and sanctuaries. So if we were going to excavate, which we're not, that's where we would be going. I've been thinking, just preparing this talk, that the grave I showed you first is probably female. She's got a big mortar and pestle just next to her, like this, and no weapons. And so what the goddess, the temple is the temple of a goddess. At Ur we have the temple of Ningal, and attached to it we have a big convent, as you might say, a nunnery, where the priestesses lived. And I'm thinking this is probably going to be priestesses being buried in there. And we know they lived there and they were buried there, and we have text recording their offerings and everything. So it would be perfectly reasonable for this to be the living quarters of the priestesses serving the temple.
And the library?
Well, I have asked my colleague Manfred Krebenich, who knows more about early dynastic tablets than almost anyone, whether any of the names of the scribes of the Abu Salabikh literary tablets, more than half of which are actually Semitic, Akkadian rather than Sumerian, whether any of those names could be women's names. Because there's no reason, particularly in the temple of Nisaba, the goddess of writing, why some of them might not have been female scribes. But that's real speculation.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can complete your work as soon as possible in Iraq. My question is about, you mentioned that there is a grave inside the house, right?
Yes.
I think this style of living is still used in my city. I am living in Najaf. It is not far from the city of Abu Salabikh. Yes. It looks for me that it's an origin for this style of life to have a living with death, let me say like that. But from the anthropological point of view in Najaf, because the value of the city and because also the ground is blessed. So what about this city? Why those people are living beside their dead people?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, the Najaf cemetery outside the domestic houses is probably the largest cemetery in the whole of the Middle East, isn't it?
Yes, but the historic part of the city is still the basement always used as a graveyard for the family living inside those old houses.
It's very strange. We don't have enough houses excavated from about 4,000 BC to tell us whether in the Uruk period, which precedes the early dynastic, they were practicing intramural burial in the houses. I have a rather sort of pragmatic approach, which is agricultural land was rather valuable, so you didn't really want to waste it by burying people in it. Whereas there was plenty of room under the floor, so you might as well put them there. But that's frivolous. We know later on in the Old Babylonian period, they built specific shrines, tombs for the people under the floor, and then on the ground floor there would be a small shrine where you made offerings, and we have text describing these offerings to the ancestors living in the house. So this is, I mean, an early version of the same thing.
Maybe. Thank you.
Any clues that you've seen
Sorry.
as to any clues at the site as to when and why the early dynastic Sumerians abandoned it, and what work could be done around the site in the future to answer